So we're exploring what it means to be a consumer. So prior we talked about the nature of the claim that we acquit ourselves of, that time is a value, and how that's in and of itself is an issue for majority of people, because when we're orientated towards life, we work under the assumption that time is a value. It's always in reference to our individual lives, and so to question its validity, the truth claim, is to really create an issue for ourselves, because it's such a dogma that we don't question the significance of that value beyond what we presuppose. So if time is considered valuable for us individually, well then obviously it is also valuable in reference to what we don't question. So we are exploring the question of our production process, of how we produce ourselves as a consumer, that is always transcendent to the people that we credit ourselves with. And so when we are questioning the truth claim and the way how that we quit ourselves of it through our lives, we need to explore that further to understand existential totalitarianism, or the nature of the debt that we incur when we presuppose time to be of value, because it's always in reference to the agency that we're credited, and ultimately the credit that we use to sanction life as a totalizing claim of a buyer's journey. So we're going to be exploring this in more detail in this episode. So in order for life to be given as a buyer's journey, or for the presupposition of our time being valuable, that means to say that we're not credited as life. All right. Now, the easiest way that we can understand this is through the transition of children that become adults. Because when we explored the nature of the claim, then are we orientated towards life as an initiation, let's say, or whether or not it's an expiation? And so we need to explore, this is always in reference to our actions, all right? And so ultimately, this is the whole point of focusing down on the one question that we don't ask, because if we incur a debt, then ultimately we won't be cognizant of it to the degree that we need to be to potentialize our actions. So we can explore the nature of the acquittal, and whether or not it's initiation or a expiation right, through that transition, or the transitioning from a child to an adult. Because if you think of people's prior to moderns in inverted commas, and this is where maybe we get a difference between what is modern and other, say, periods, that if there is a totalizing claim that we acquit ourselves of, it totalizes life to the exclusions of other ways of being or doing. Now, prior to the imposition of that totalizing claim of time being a value, well, ultimately people can orientate themselves towards life in different ways. That was primarily done collectively as people. We have the pretense that we're individuals, but we are individuals, we are marginally given through the time that we presuppose. So the spirituality that underwrites our actions, where we have the pretense to autonomy, is obviously conditioned upon the marginal way that we're given to that autonomy. And we don't question that. Why? Because I don't question the nature of the credit that we use when we're orientated towards it. And then ultimately we don't look at the transition from the way how a child is dependent and becomes independent, and the nature of what happens in that transition. And so if you think of when we're looking at children and they have to become adults, like the world is the way how the world is. It's just, and this is a platitude that's often inveighed against children, and it's ultimately got to do that you're not really meant to question the way how life is given. And so therefore, if there's an orientation, then ultimately you're meant to be orientated towards the way how your parents have handed it down without the requisite questioning. And this is literally civilizational. And so you, through orientating towards independence as an ideal, condition the independence that you can achieve when you use a credit you are not the originator of. And how can we say that? Well, if you presuppose time to be of value, and then ultimately it's in reference to your individual life and the way how you secure what you would think to be is a life commensurate to your time, and so the value of your time, that is an orientation where you incur a debt of insufficiency, we can say. All right, so the insufficiency here is in reference to the child that you are, to the adult that you become. So if you think of like prior peoples, what was the insufficiency of children? Well, and this relates primarily for men in particular, because a girl that becomes a woman is done through biology. All right, it's through menstruation. With boys, it's completely different. So there was a rite of passage for boys, okay? So when there's a rite of passage, what are you doing? You're taking the state of insufficiency or your status, and through that rite, you become, through however way this was created, that rite of passage, then upon your return, you're accepted as an equal to the men within the tribe, let's say. Now, when you're looking at it from modernity's point of view, everybody is insufficient, all right? And so ultimately the orientation towards sufficiency, self-sufficiency, you've got to think of what self-sufficiency here means. Yourself as a marginal self, because you presuppose time to be of value. So the orientation towards that transitioning that we talk about to overcome the insufficiency is always in reference to the marginal self that's never questioned when adults are telling you that's the way how the world works, and how the way how the world works is given in such a way that you don't question the production process of yourself as the consumer that you're given as, that is always transcendent to the value that you sold yourself on, because obviously time given as a value is the means of your production. So that's the form of life to sanction the way how things are given, to sanction the way how life is given as a buyer's journey. So the state of insufficiency is an orientation that occurs through you accruing credit. But how in that circumstance, when you're securing credit, so that means to say that you get a job, you start to be orientated towards your own financial independence, as it were. Well, how can you overcome the original insufficiency of the self when you are acquitting yourself of the truth claim that time is of value? So at the moment, when we're dealing with, say, issues of the debasement of currency that comes through, say, a debt-based system, the questioning that comes along with critiquing, say, a finance and parasitism that relates to banking in particular doesn't go far enough when you're looking at the truth claim of that time as a value. So what happens is that people get beholden to credit, all right, so the origination of credit, the way how that occurs, it's miraculated by bankers, it's magical, but then they don't go one step further and think, okay, is time of value or not? We presuppose that time to be of value, well, what is the credit that we're accruing? Is there an existential insufficiency that's built into our way of life that we can never overcome? So that's the originary debt. All right. So when you're looking at an originary debt, how can you, through your orientation, when you presuppose time to be a value, ever overcome that originary insufficiency? There's no way. Why? Because you use a credit you are not the originator of. So you are at the behest of other people that market the means of you attaining financial independence. Okay, so think of that. If this credit that you use is sanctioned through through magic, which is essentially what it is, and you make it true, all right, you make the claim on time true through your actions, then obviously you're legitimizing the way of marketing that credit in order for you to be orientated towards that independence that is always conditioned. And if it's always conditioned, why is that a problem? Well, then it becomes to the nature of the debt and the nature of the credit that you use. And if you don't connect the two, you won't understand what's occurring now when we're talking about social credit systems, or potentially the requalification of life that we got a glimpse of when the pandemic occurred, and the way how that they were trying to ration the orientation towards social life, or let's say you go one step further, the way how that you would qualify people's consumption through the credit that people use. But that means to say that you're always at the behest of somebody else. Okay, so if you're at the behest of somebody else through utilizing a credit you are not the originator of, and yet your critique of credit systems only goes so far as the origination of the credit and the debasement of the credit, but you don't look at, well, hang on, what can you be credited as a human being when life's given as a bias genie? Come down to, you can only demand, you can't command. You are not credited as a creative. And so therefore the originary insufficiency is predicated upon that you do not create the world, that you're in a perpetual state of insufficiency, and because you've outsourced creation once again. So that gives you, so if you look at it from that perspective, the form of life of the consumer is getting requalified through the restructuring of the debt. Okay, so the debt here is, once again, you're insufficient, so you use a credit you are not the originator of. You can never overcome that originary insufficiency, and so therefore there's a difference between the credit that you accrue and that originary debt, and there's always a gap there, and that gap allows the requalification of the credit that you use. And as a result of that, what you're going to have the machinations of corporations and the state that work together to requalify you. They're requalifying the form of life. This is the thing that people don't understand when you don't, once again, when you don't consider the form of life of the consumer and the way how we produce ourselves. You're not a fucking person, as I keep on saying. You're just not. For our whole paradigm, for our whole system, for our commerce, you are given as a demand center. So your demand is going to be qualified through the resetting of the credit. And so if you're looking at the orientation of the system at the moment, and it's potentially bankrupt because bankers have created this system where they're pushing the can down the road. Now you have different forms of, say, crypto that are coming in to fill a gap. Well, and through stable coins and through Bitcoin and all these things. What is the given with these things? Well, you're still a demand center, even if these other, why is crypto marketed so much? Because that's one of the things that money does. It markets its legitimacy as a credit. Now, we don't understand, especially if you're looking at the crypto space, that the majority of, say, the conversation around it as a form of payment or form of credit, it's people are just marketing the legitimacy of it, or how it can address certain kind of issues with the current, say, system. What they don't question is the fact that, is time of value? Because if you ask that question, then they'll say absolutely yes, it's valuable. But then they won't. Then the disconnect here is that, okay, your time is valuable in reference to your life. People we don't question, but it's also a value in reference to your production. But you don't fucking question that. You don't understand. And then you think of, well, if that's the case, once again, we come back to the nature of the religiosity and whether or not our lives are expiation rights or initiatory rights. Because if the only reason why we presuppose time to be of value is because of the belief that we have that it's true, it's still predicated on a belief. But that belief in it creates the very mechanism of our capture, let's say, and how you can never atone for being born. Because once again, to atone for being born, well, what is it? Well, you're discounting your originary birth, and because you become twice born through the use of a credit you are not the originator of. Think of what that means when you become twice born. Well, twice born means to say that you go from being a dependent to being independent, but your independent is qualified through the debt that you can never overcome. So therefore, you're a penitent. All right. And so if you're a penitent, you are paying a debt for being born. And this is the immanentization of theology. All right. So when, like, let's say if you were looking at, say, Nietzsche's critique of Christianity, it never drilled it down into the nature of the credit of money and, say, an existential insufficiency in reference to the life, the dust man, the last man. If we think the last man is just a consumer, obviously that development it wasn't developed as much as what it is now for you to explore how this theology gets immanentized and where you are never going to overcome that unless you work back to the one question that we refuse to ask, and then then you're considering it from your actions and whether or not you're atoning for being born. Because if it's not an initiation rite, then it's an expiation. You're atoning for something, and you don't even know what you're atoning for. This is the thing. This is where cognitive dissonance comes into it, because people are completely oblivious that the commerce, like I said, there's one trade, and that's what we'll explore in the next episode, is the nature of that trade, which I call existential arbitrage, where you essentially externalize, and then you allow, obviously, the power that you don't animate, which is the power of the creation, to be sold back to you through the intermediaries. And so intermediaries of what? Well, of a religious truth claim. Okay, you got to think that our entire way of life, if we're talking about priesthood, where, you know, technocrats are just a new fandangled priests. That's all they are. And so what essentially they're working in the same way as what the Catholic Church did maybe back, 1,500 years ago, where they were the intermediaries between, the person and the kingdom of heaven, and the saving their soul. So, but in here, this case, the original sin is to be born, because you can never overcome the original issue of a religious truth claim, that people don't understand that secularism, what we call secularism, or what we call modernity, is literally the immanentization of a theology, and so therefore your lives are an expiation, right? You can never accrue enough credit to be orientated towards life indivisibly. So this is the difference between spiritualities, which we'll cover off again later, because you're marginally given through the time that you presuppose, and so therefore you condition your freedom as a result of it. Anyway, cheers.